I hope you got the Marmakomos. We can see the significance of Pikuach Nefesh in the Psak of the Mechaber and Hilchas Shabbos, in the case where we allow a non-Jew to start a fire, a little campfire, in order to generate heat for children. And because of the cold and the impact it could have, we're going to allow not only the children to benefit from the heat, but even the Gedolim, even the mature people. Because the doctors are telling us that some of the older people, some of the adults, are very sensitive to the cold, and therefore they need this heat. Normally, we don't allow benefiting from a malachas akum, but in this case, we're going to do so. Shulchan Aruch in Yoredeya, likewise, relies on a heter for cholim, and that's in Simon Kuf Tezayin. In the case of Dever Ba'ir, there's some sort of an epidemic in the city, and the Mechaber writes, we have to get out of the city as soon as possible. Don't wait until this Magefa, this Dever spreads. Move at the speed of light. And then the Shulchan Aruch, which I'd like to read to you, codifies a statement which appears in the Rambam. The Rambam writes it in Perkei Alf Milchus Rotzeach, and the Shulchan Aruch mentions it here. He says, Kol elu advarim, all these circumstances, all these situations in which we have to move very quickly, and sometimes we even have to violate the Torah, they all fit into the category of sakana, mishum sakana, because of danger. B'shomer nafsho yirchak mehem. He says that a person has to be very careful about his health, and he should run away from any of these dangerous situations. And the Mechaber writes, also lismoch on nes. We're not allowed to rely on miracles, or l'sake nafsho, or to expose ourselves to any sort of a danger. B'chol kayotzi bazeh, in anything that's similar to this. Now, I'd like to read to you the words of the Shulchan Aruch. So far, we've read from Orach Chaim. Now we read from Yoredeya. And here I'd like to read to you from Choshen Mishpat. This is the very last halacha in the 4 codes of the Shulchan Aruch. He writes, Kol michshal sheyesh bo sakonis nefashos. Any kind of a danger, any kind of a michshal is like an impediment, which could lead to sakana, to danger. Mitzvahs aseh la'asiro, we have a positive command to remove anything that could endanger us. Uli shamim mimenu, and to avoid any contact with that which could be dangerous. Ula hazir lihizayer b'davar yafeh, to be very meticulous and careful about it. Shenemar hishamar lecha ushmar nafshecha. And then not only does the Mechaber quote of mitzvahs say a positive command, he goes a step further. He says, "V'im lo heisir," if he didn't remove these possible dangerous impediments, v'iniach hamichsholos, and he left all these things around, hamavim lidei sakana, they can lead to danger. Bitel mitzvahs essay, not only has he violated a positive command of hishamar lecha shmar nafshecha, but moreover, over mishum lotasim damim b'eisecha. Now, this last siman in Shulchan Aruch, in the entire Shulchan Aruch, but certainly in Choshen Mishpat, is all about protecting human life. and a mitzvah saseh to remove any sort of michshol that could have sakonis nefashos. And most of what the Mechaber codifies here in the Siman is about makeh, the mitzvah to put up a fence around a dangerous roof, a high roof. But he extends this beyond the mitzvah of makeh. The mitzvah of makeh is limited to a fence around a roof. What about other michsholos? Are they likewise included in both the essay and the los aseh? And that's where the Mechaber, based on the Rambam, expands the application, the scope of makeh to include any sakonis nefashos, anything that has an element of danger to it. Now, on the Shulchan Aruch, in all four halakim, we have something called the Be'er HaGola. Let me just say a few words. The Be'er HaGola, Rav Moshe Ravkish, was one of the great Rabbanim in the city of Vilna, and he took it upon himself to mention, attached to the Shulchan Aruch, every source that he could find for the Shulchan Aruch. Very rarely does the Be'er HaGola give you more than 1 or 2 lines. But in this case, he has what I'd call a ganze Megillah. It's as long as the Gola, as long as the Be'er HaGola, the exile. And he points out, let me just find the relevant Be'er HaGola. He says, Chasav Rambam, Hilchas Ovel Mitzvah Shel Devreim Levakir Cholim, fine. And then he says that there's a general mitzvah here. He says of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. So it means that not only do I have to worry about my own danger, but I have to worry about danger in general. And he says that kol hadvarim shata rotze sheyasu otzam l'cha cherev, anything that you want others to do to you, aseh otzam ata otzam liachicha b'torah v'mitzvahs, and you should do for them what you want them, and you expect and hope that they will do for you. He says that this is a great mitzvah, and his hira Torah al Shmiras HaNefesh, this is all an extension of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You're not only worrying about saving yourself, but not in any way endangering others. He writes, HaKadosh Baruch Hu baras ha'olam bechazdo lehetiv lanivroim. God created the world with compassion and out of a sense of love for all his creations, that they should recognize his greatness, they should serve him by fulfilling his mitzvahs and his Torah. Quotes the pasuk in Yeshaya, it says, Kol hanikra b'shmi l'chvodi v'asiv v'litel lehem schar tov, and to grant a great deal of reward for them, for their good deeds. And then he writes, listen to this. I think this is like the punchline. He says, Hamasakin es atzmo, if a person endangers his life, Keilu moes biratzon boro, it's like he finds the will of God, of his creator, to be repulsive. And Eina Rotze, he doesn't want lo bavodaso, not to serve God. For lo matan scharo, he's not interested in the reward for serving Hashem and fulfilling his mitzvahs. Ein lecha zilzul api kursa yosef mizeh, by exposing himself to danger, indicating that he's not interested in living in this world and fulfilling God's will. This is a zilzul. this is apicursus. He says there's no greater apicursus than that. And therefore, Lashomim, for those who listen carefully to what the Mechaber is saying, and again, as I said, it's word for word from the Rambam, Yunam, he will experience pleasantness. V'noam Hashem Elokeinu aleinu masi yadeinu kodno aleinu. And then Hashem will bestow upon us great things for our extra effort in trying to protect ourselves for the purpose of fulfilling God's will. It's an amazing piece, so atypical. And with this, and the concept of preventing oneself from any exposure to danger, and certainly others, that's how he ends the Shulchan Aruch. That becomes the apex of the entire Shulchan Aruch. Now, I mentioned to you at the outset that there are comments in other halakim in the Shulchan Aruch, also regarding sakana and avoiding danger. We mentioned the Shulchan Aruch in Hilchos Shabbos with regard to heating up a room when there's a chill in the room, allowing a guy to do that for you. But we have an interesting piece in the Shulchan Aruch Taf Kuf Ayin Vav, which is also an Aruch Chaim. And the Mechaber talks about a certain disease, cholium, he doesn't specify. But the Mishnah Brura, describing apparently the epidemic that was most dangerous in his time, 100 years ago, he speaks about abubuos horchim bitinokos, kind of measles, maybe mumps, umesim, and children die from this disease. First, he says, yesh ligzar tainis. If there is a widespread disease, then we should declare a public fast. And then he adds that there's a special slicha, meaning a special prayer, that we should say in the case of these ababuos. Then he quotes the Shalah. And by the way, all this is based on the Magen Avram, but we'll see in a second that the Magen Avram adds a few words which the Mishnah Brura had omitted. That kol echad yavriach banav min ha'ir. As soon as he finds out that there is this danger and that his children could chas v'shalom get exposed to this disease, he should run away, flee from the city. B'eis hazos dehi machala misdabekes, because it is a contagious disease. Now, if you look in the Magen Avram, which is the source for this Mishnah Brura, he adds v'im lo asazos, and if he didn't flee from the city and take all the precautions that are necessary, hein chayovim b'nafshosehem, then you are guilty of causing chas v'shalom this situation of death. And here in Israel, they recently published a small pamphlet that's called Halacha L'Maisa, and it has to do with the Rabbanim here in the city based on this disease. And they write that if children may have been exposed to this disease, then they need to take a vaccine. But if, let's say, there are certain children, very few, in the class, and the parents did not take the children for the vaccine, other parents are very nervous about this situation. They, the majority, can force the minority that the parents who have not taken this vaccine for their children, in that case of a very dangerous disease for children, they have two choices. Either they give the children the vaccine or they find themselves a different classroom. And all this is going to become very relevant now when in the next few days, schools are going to have to make decisions about children. The Rambam codifies a Gemara in Masechta Sanhedrin. The Gemara says that there are 10 requirements, 10 conditions that have to be met in any city in order for a scholar to live in that city. And on the list, the Rambam has in Hilchos Deis, Perek Daled Halacha Chav Gimel, is a rofe. Now, a lot of people in the last couple of days have been talking about the Tiferes Yisrael. The Tiferes Yisrael, centuries ago, wrote a commentary on the Mishnah. It's called the Yochin Uboaz. Yochin on one side, the Boaz on the other. And at the end of Masechta Yoma, where the Gemara discusses all sorts of different dangerous situations, he speaks about vaccines. He calls them inoculation. And again, it's a word that has about 20 letters to it. It's very hard to make it out, but it's inoculation. You'll trust me on that. And again, because of this disease that was so prominent 100 and 200 years ago, he says that even though this is a pella of a chidush, as a result of the inoculation, there are 1 out of 1,000 cases of death. He says, nevertheless, we have a principle in halacha that Rashoy ha'odam lahachnis es atzmo v'sakana rechoka k'dei lahatzil es atzmo misakana krova. If you have a definite danger, you're allowed to expose yourself actively to that danger, even if it means that you are exposing yourself to a chance of chas v'shalom, the worst, as a result of this inoculation. But if overall the inoculation will be better than worse, and the statistical probabilities that will protect you outweigh the chances of chas v'shalom death, then he says, mutar, rashai, he's allowed to take the inoculation. Now, what I'd like to discuss with you is the following. Just to summarize the main points that we've made so far, the Shulchan Aruch has taken, based on the Rambam, the requirement of avoiding sakana, which is rooted in the mitzvah of makeh, and he's applied it and extended it way beyond the bounds of makeh. And the one who pointed this out at the time of the Rishonim is the Sefer Achinuch. In mitzvah Taf Kuf Mem Vav, which is the mitzvah of makeh, he says that this mitzvah requires not just to put a fence around your roof, but to protect yourself from danger in general, any sort of danger, keep safe. That's included and derived from the mitzvah of makeh. Now, the Gemara in Brachos on Daf Lamed Beis speaks about one of the giants, one of the sages who was davening publicly, and one of the officers of the government saw this and he said, "Aren't you afraid of danger?" And he quoted this pasuk of Hishamar Lecha, that you have to watch out for danger. The Gemara in Shavuos says that if a person brings upon himself a klala, a curse of any sort, then he violates the law of Hishamar Lecha. So we see over and over again that Chazal quote this pasuk Hishamar Lecha in a very expansive way to apply and encompass any sort of danger. Okay. Now, what I'd like to spend a few minutes of your time with, if you got to Maramakomos, is a translation of a tshuva of Rav Asher Weiss. And then to study a few of the Makoros from Rav Shechter. But when we study Rav Asher Weiss, truth be told, he opens up this presentation by telling us that many of the rabbinic leaders and other leaders in the Jewish community and wider public have been asking about guidance regarding this new vaccine, COVID-19. Number one, is it permissible? Is it better to refrain from it? Is it obligatory to be vaccinated for the purpose of protecting oneself and others? Now, the truth is that there aren't too many great chidushim in this particular presentation. He quotes the Tiferes Yisrael that we saw earlier, and he talks about the first vaccine, which was introduced 250 years ago by Dr. Edward Jenner as a result of the smallpox, ababuos, and so forth and so on. And although the Tiferes Yisrael says Rashai, that you're allowed to be inoculated, he doesn't go as far as to say you're obligated to be inoculated. And this becomes a very main issue in the writings of Rav Weiss. He is no doubt on board for the vaccine. He questions, though, and we'll see about it in just a minute, whether or not one is obligated to take the vaccine. Now, he quotes a sefer called Alim Litrufa, which was authored by one of the Rabbanim of Holland. His name was Rabbi Avram Hamburg. And he quotes many tshuvas that people should receive the smallpox vaccine in spite of the fact that there is a slight danger, as we said before, 1 in 1,000 people perish. Then he quotes the Sefer Zera Emes, one of the Sephardic greats, and in that tshuva, which is called Shut Zera Emes, he records a dialogue back and forth between him and one of the other great poskim in the generation of Chaim Yehuda Giron. The latter was in favor of refraining from a vaccination because several people had died from this vaccination. Even though the risk to any individual member of the population was remote, but nevertheless, you cannot expose yourself. The Zera Emes writes against this, and he basically comes to the conclusion that we should recommend taking this vaccination because the disease and the threat of the disease by far is greater than the fear of the possible 1 in 1,000 that might die as a result of the vaccine. Now, Rav Weiss has another tshuva here that he quotes called the Zivchei Tzedek. And he comes to the conclusion that, let me just get the right page here for a second. If you're up to page 2 of these pages, which actually says 4 on the bottom because there are 2 fly pages at the beginning, he says we should offer praise to God for having given us expert doctors who know how to prepare inoculations. And this is something that Hashem has sent us. So as we saw before, when we started our discussion, the Rofim are quoted in the Shulchan Aruch. And this example of smallpox vaccine is one of those examples where the Halach and the Poskim quote the Rofim. And he writes, now that the doctors are wiser and they administer vaccinations by means of an injection into children's arms, which prevents them from developing smallpox. And this is an absolute go-ahead. So the poskim back in the era of smallpox are all bearing in favor of undergoing the vaccination, again, despite the small risk associated with the vaccination. And here we have a principle of what's called a rov she'ein lo miut. What do we mean? We have something called a miuta de miuta. In halacha, there's always a way out possibility. In pikuach nefesh, we are very concerned even about miuta de miuta, but we weigh that against the rov. And if the rov would have it that we're more likely to be exposed to a very deadly disease, then that trumps the miuta de miuta. Now, after this whole introduction, the rabbi gives us a little bit of background to the actual development of the vaccine that is now being presented. And a lot of what I read here, I had heard from Dr. Aaron Glatt in a session together with Rabbi Mordechai Willig, which again, I sent you the link. If you haven't heard it, it's worthwhile. This Dr. Glatt is very big in the Cornell Hospital, which is one of the most significant hospitals in New York and probably in the entire country. And he's an expert in this particular field. And he describes the clinical studies and the tests that they did in 2 different companies that were backed by the United States government financially, because it requires literally billions of dollars of research, and no drug company is willing to risk going bankrupt in event that they can't come up with any vaccine. So the government took it upon itself to back it up so that these companies were not at risk to lose all their financial base. And both companies were working independently towards creating a vaccine, and each one tested over 40,000 people. Now, they tested people from the age bracket of 20 and up. So the people, let's say in the age bracket of 17, 18, 19, 20 have not yet been tested. But it's amazing that both tests led to the exact same conclusion. And they both came up with the same vaccination and the same results of the studies, of the clinical studies. So you're talking about 40,000 people in each study. No one died. Not one person who took the vaccine died. There were those who were given placebo because that's how you do a test, and some of them had died. So therefore, Rav Weiss, in his presentation, and I heard the same thing from Dr. Glatt, medical experts have developed and approved in record time these vaccines as effective and safe. Those are the 2 main words here, effective and safe. Now, are there dissenting views? Very confusing. There are certain, how shall I say, conservatives who are afraid, 5 years down the line and so forth and so on. But according to Dr. Glatt, as an expert in this field, the whole development of this vaccine in 9 months' time defies human comprehension. We've never ever seen, and the nature of this vaccine is so radical and so different than all other vaccines. I'm not here to give you a scientific presentation, but suffice it to say, it's not like the old time vaccines that we're familiar with that already expose you to they give you the germs itself. They give you the flu as a vaccine. It works in a whole different way. But he says, this is a physician who's saying that this has to be from God. How could it be that 2 different companies working independently with their own clinical experiments would come up with the same results and the same vaccine? There's virtually no difference. One of the 2 vaccines needs a freezing process. So in terms of the engineering, it's in distributing the vaccine, you have to make sure that it's minus 100 degrees, very free, but so therefore it may take a little bit more time. But both are the same and equally both effective and safe. Rav Weiss writes that one of the axioms of halacha is reliance upon medical data. And the halacha guides us to accept the guidance of the Rofim, and we'll get back to that in Rav Shechter's collection of Maramakomos mostly from the Chassam Sofer. And he tells us that Rabbi Yechezkel Katzenellenbogen, who was the author of the Shut Knesses Yechezkel in the 18th century, was one of the Gedolei Ador. He writes that we have to give support for the position of the doctors. In that case, it has to do with fasting on Yom Kippur during the cholera epidemic. And the doctors advise that even healthy people should not fast on Yom Kippur at the time of the outbreak of cholera. We've discussed this in the past with the story of Rabbi Sosalanter. Now, what did I want to point out to you here about the presentation of Rav Weiss? He says the following: the efficacy and safety of the COVID-19 vaccine has been attested to by thousands upon thousands of medical experts, and there's no basis for concern about side effects or about death that might be associated with the vaccine. And he goes on to say, this is more of a spiritual, supernatural kind of paragraph, that Shomer P'sayim Hashem, that even an event, heaven forbid, that there was somewhere along the line that the experts made it a mistake, but God will protect us. Fine. Now, you read this tshuva of Rav Weiss, and you go back to his original question: am I obligated to take this vaccine? And here's where I don't know what to say. I mean, here's where he kind of deviates from the whole presentation. Because as we discussed, we're talking about a mitzvah say of Hisham Malacha, we're talking about a lo saseh of lo tazim damim b'veisecha. It would seem that in the case of a vaccine, the experts that we rely on have told us it's safe, and the chance of any sort of danger is negligible. And the nature of the coronavirus that he writes, and this is just a few days ago, is rapidly spreading in our communities in all of the world, causing many deaths each day. And the death toll amounts. Some of those who have recovered from the virus are continuing to suffer from long-term effects. Some studies have revealed that the virus causes irreversible damage to the body systems. I'm just waiting for the punchline that we're obligated to take this vaccine. I tell you the honest truth. I played a game with myself. I covered sometimes, especially when I read the Tshuvos of Rav Avad Yosef, I don't always have patience. I don't have time. So what I do is I read the Shaila, and then I cover the last paragraph, and I guess what he's going to say. It's a lot of fun. I don't know if you've ever done it. And that's what I did here. But I decided that before I lift my hand up, that's covering the bottom line of this tshuva, I'm going to read through the entire tshuva. And I authored the conclusion of the tshuva that you're obligated to take this vaccine. Says Rav Weiss, In light of all the above, it is appropriate for each person to be vaccinated. Listen to that word, appropriate. I'm beginning to hear echoes of the Tiferes Yisrael. Like you're allowed to take the inoculation despite the element of danger. But here Rav Weiss has written for 3 pages that there is no element of danger. It is certainly appropriate to be vaccinated. However, I cannot rule that there is an obligation to be vaccinated. Why not? He says, every person has the right to refrain from vaccinating, but rather to continue wearing a mask, to practice social distancing, basically saying, we don't necessarily need the vaccination. We can solve this problem. I can protect myself, my own health, and prevent the infection to others. I won't infect anyone else. Why? Because number 1, I wear a mask. And number 2, I practice social distancing. And therefore, it's appropriate, it's acceptable, maybe if it's admirable, to take the vaccine, but I cannot rule that there's an obligation to do so. Now, if by any chance you heard or have the time to hear Rabbi Willig, then we finally get the whole long version. I've been quoting Rabbi Willig over the last couple of months in our regular shir on Wednesdays. And it drives me nuts, because what we get from Rav Willig is like a one-liner. And if you have a chance, listen to this one. It's not a one-liner. He goes on and on for a half hour. He tells us that he had a conversation with Reb Shmuel Kamenetsky of the Philly Yeshiva, and Reb Kamenetsky denied this whole business that, we can't take the vaccination. It's all a conspiracy. And Reb Shmuel says, just get the okay from your local doctor who knows your clinical, your medical history, and take the vaccination. Rabbi Willig quotes a Rabbi Dr. Fira, who has an organization called Ezra Lamarpe, who again tells us to take the vaccine. He says they asked Reb Chaim Kanevsky, and he says tzrichim, to get a word out of Reb Chaim Kanevsky, that's tzrichim, meaning we have to take the vaccine. Then they asked him about the side effects. He said lo lefached. So now we have 3 words, right? Tzrichim and lo lefached. And then he adds his famous 2 words, bracha v'atzlacha. So we get from Reb Chaim Kanevsky 5 words. That's more than we usually get from him. Then Rav Willig is very close to Rab David Cohen from Brooklyn, who, if I'm not mistaken, is a graduate of the Chaim Berlin Yeshiva and belongs, to the world of the yeshivot. And Rav Willig said that he also is on board. Now, there's another Rab David Cohen here in Yerushalayim. He's the Rosh Yeshiva of Hebron Yeshiva. He married off my children. Anyway, Rab David Cohen said that he's going to take the vaccination. He thinks everyone has to take the vaccination. Rav Willig ends his presentation by pointing out that Rav Weiss comes shy of establishing an obligation because Rav Weiss is getting false information. Somebody is telling Rav Weiss that if you wear a mask without being vaccinated, you wear a mask and you maintain social distancing, then you've solved the problem. You're out of danger. And Rav Willig said that's simply not true. And they've proven statistically that many people, unfortunately, tragically, have contracted the disease, despite the fact that they were so-called careful with social distancing and with wearing masks. Rav Willig points out that, the mask is a little bit unreliable sometimes. Also, we sometimes fail to wear it exactly the way we should. And the social distancing, you go here, you go to a shul. He has a whole discussion there. You want to hear it about Rav Willig's decision to close the shuls when the epidemic broke out. This was a very difficult decision. He got a lot of flack for it. And he said that when Yeshiva University decided to close the university, that was also a very major decision. And those decisions were made very early, because you may know that one of the people from New Rochelle contracted the disease very, very bad and infected many, many other people. That's mamish in the early stage, around Purim time. And one of the members of that family was a mispalel in Rabbi Willig Shul. Another one was a student at Yeshiva University, and they closed shuls, they closed schools. And Rav Willig is convinced that they saved the death of untold numbers of people as a result. But to go ahead and say that just because you're wearing a mask and you're distancing, that therefore you're absolutely protected, no way, no how. So therefore, from a halachic perspective, there are no two options, according to Rav Willig. It's not like you have option number one, try out the mask and social distancing, and option number two, try the vaccine. But once we have determined, based on the expert advice, that the vaccine is safe and effective, which is not the case, at least as far as effective is concerned, with regard to some even question whether it's safe. But anyway, it's whether it's effective in the case of social distancing and wearing masks. He has no doubt, Rabbi Willig, that if Rav Weiss would be aware of that reality, then he would certainly have paskin that's an absolute chiyuv. Now, I personally heard from Rav Shechter in a video that he was asked the question as to whether or not we should be reciting Hatova HaMeitiv as a bracha. You get another bottle of wine that's better than the first one, you make Hatova HaMeitiv. And this bracha of Hatova HaMeitiv applies whenever HaKadosh Baruch Hu does a Hatova for the community at large, for the entire tzibur. And he was asked whether or not we should recite Hatova HaMeitiv, and he responded by saying probably yes. He came short of saying an absolute yes. And Rav Willig writes that if you look in Orach Chaim Siman Reish Lamed, there's a tefillah for a refuah, Yehi Ratzon, and he says he thinks it's very appropriate to recite that tefillah, Yehi Ratzon, when one is going in for the vaccination. The last piece in Rav Willig is whether or not we should exclude people from shul who refuse to take the vaccination, and should we refuse to allow them to send their children to school if the children have to be vaccinated. He said we're not ready for that stage yet, and we'll cross that when we come to it, because right now the children are not getting vaccinated. Now, I mentioned to you at the outset that if you receive the Mar Makomos, and I always want to thank David for circulating them, then you've seen that Rav Shechter, in his collection of Mar Makomos, references a number of tshuvas from the Chassam Sofer. And I would just like to highlight some of those tshuvas. These tshuvas are by and large taken from Yoredeya in the laws of Nida. And the first tshuva, which is on the third page of the Mar Makomos that you've gotten, addresses a sugya in Nida. And the case was that a woman had a miscarriage, and usually, it's 99%, if not 100%, that when a woman has a miscarriage, then there's dam, and the dam is metame. And the Gemara tells us that she, in this case, had a very, very strange kind of a thing that came out of her body. And the Gemara describes it in gory details. But then the Gemara tells us that the Rofim, the experts in the medical field, said that something, they made a medical, shall I say, observation called Ein Hamakar Nishtarbev, that this could not be Damna Makar, and this is coming from a different source in our body. And the Gemara said that they tested it out. The Rofim told them that they could test this out and describe the test. They had to soak it in water. And the Gemara says that we should be somech on these experts, on these Rofim. And here, the Chassam Sofer quotes a tshuva from the Dvar Shmuel, who says that we, the Chachamim, are mehemon tfei me'arofim. If there's a clash, a contradiction between the Rofim and the Chachmei Yisrael, meaning if the Chachmei Yisrael have a certain tradition that establishes halachic facts on the ground, and the Rofim contradict, then the Dvar Shmuel, for his point, says that we will rely on Chachmei Yisrael against the Rofim. And he uses a phrase here which has to be understood. He says, Einenu roos shal yedei igul v'tabah shal shava chozel l'malam imkomo, etc., etc. The Chassam Sofer, in commenting on this tshuva of the Dvar Shmuel, that the Chachmei Yisrael know better than the Rofim, and they paskin the halacha, he says, the inyan emunas harofim, you'll see this on the bottom left, it's the third page of our Makomos. He says, Lo heminu l'rofim al guf yadua lemar guf zeh mapil shumos v'saros, meaning that this is not really a leda in any sense. We don't rely on the rofim, but he points out that that's al guf yadua. Let's try to explain what he means by guf yadua. Ein harofim nemonim al guf yadua. He has one exception. We'll get back to that in a minute. But heminu chazal l'rofim biklal hateva. So he has two, all told 4 words, 2 words against 2 words. There's a contrast here between what he calls guf yadua as opposed to klal hateva. And the difference is that we believe the Rofim in describing the nature of medical facts on the ground. That's called klal hateva. So, for example, if they tell us that there is a metzius in the world of a woman who's mapil, shuma v'saros, this kind of very strange phenomenon, and they tell us that you can verify that it was that kind of a hapola of shuma v'saros, because you throw it into the water and you'll test it out, etc., etc. For that, they're believed. However, al guf yadua, that they should give you a final psak and rule, they meaning the Rofim, on this individual, that's called guf yadua, that's not in their realm. The Torah doesn't give them nemonis. And he says the following, that based on this Gemara Nida, which is on Chav Beis, he says that the testimony of the Rofim in and of itself would not have been reliable except for the fact that we could rely and somchim ala bedika. But without the aidance of the Rofim that already anticipated what would be the results of this laboratory test, lo hayu somchin ala bedika, so we wouldn't know about it, and certainly we wouldn't rely upon it. So the Rofim give us the klali ateva. They will reveal and will rely on them to give us an insight into the natural law of the universe and how biologically things operate. They will therefore predict that if they are right, then this is what you're going to see in the lab test, in the results, and we're going to rely on that lab test. We're going to paskin for this woman, whether she has a din of yoledes, and whether she's tmeya and so forth and so on. We're going to base our decision, though, on the Rofim, because they are going to reveal to us the teva and how to check out the situation given scientific facts on the ground. And on the top of the next page, the Chassam Sofer goes on to say that Achshav Toli B'Shchicha Al Pi Eidus HaRofim. He says, if the testimony and the description of reality of biological nature of the Rofim repeats itself to be true over and over again, we see that they're reliable, they are mumchim, they are experts, then we rely on the Eidus HaRofim, but not on the Guf Yodua, not on the case in front of us. Eino Nem. Now, I mentioned to you before that there is one area of Ne'emanus that's granted to the Rofim on a Guf Yodua, even according to some Sofer. And I skipped that line, I'll go back to it. He says, Chutz, the exception is, Li'inyan Pikuach Nefesh, Lasos Oso Safek Pikuach Nefesh, V'lidchos Isur Misafek. So that although we don't have Ne'emanus in the case of the Rofim on the Guf Yodua, so theoretically we should not be able to be Machal Shabbos or allow this victim, this sick person, to eat on Yom Kippur based on the aidance of the Rofim because they don't have Ne'emanus. But nevertheless, if they take a look at this individual and they say, you know what, he's in a very dangerous situation. If he fasts on Yom Kippur, that might lower his immune system and he may die. Or, in general, in a case of a Rofe, and it's a Shabbos issue, the Rofim are relied upon to create a suffix. It's not that we're listening to them and they are ruling on this case, but they give us enough question so that if they say there's a danger involved over here, it creates a suffix pikuach nefesh. And therefore, Eino nemon el lasso suffix pikuach nefesh. So we have two areas of reliability of the Rofim in Allah. One is klal ateva, to give us the insight as to how to evaluate natural phenomenon and perhaps give us a lab test to prove it. And number two, as far as this individual is concerned, the Guf Yodua, the Nido that we're dealing with and judging whether we can violate Isurim on his behalf, the Rofim are reliable to create a suffix. And as a result of that suffix, we will override the Jewish law. And that's this very, very important tshuva of the Chassam Sofer. Now, in another tshuva, this one is in Even Ezer, has to do with the case of a kroshivcha, a man who has a certain illness, and the question is whether his private parts have been mutilated and so forth and so on. And the question is, can we rely on the Rofim who say that he is still healthy? In other words, he underwent a certain whole recovery program, and they evaluate and say, well, we know that at this point he can have children. In other words, he's already well on the way to recovery. And this has to do with a very important halacha because Krushivcha lo yova b'kal Hashem. If he is a Krushivcha, then he's not allowed to marry a Jewish girl. And that's why this truth is here in Even Ezer in the laws of marriage. And the Chassam Sofer writes, which again, it's on my page 6 in there are 8 pages of Mar Makomos, he writes, Ha'emes Yored Darko, Ki heminu kabolas harofim al pi teva. Sheyesh b'teva, we relied in the case of Nida that we mentioned earlier. Sheyesh b'teva, shia isha shuma b'yosam makom. Umimena mateles kamin saros. Again, that Gemara Nida Chav Beis. Ach lehamin al pi umdira shemishayir b'chachmaso sheyesh lazu shuma ein anu somchim al omet shelo dilma toe b'dimyon. B'dai lanu shal sesafik l'yin pikuach nefesh b'chil Shabbos v'yom HaKippur. He says that if the doctors are simply evaluating the case and they are not sure, they're not absolutely certain, they have what's called an umdana. Umdana means they evaluate the situation and the mishayir. Mishayir means they think, the evidence has them inclined in one direction, that this is shuma, meaning it's not a leda, then we will not rely on their umdana. They have to give us hardcore evidence. Again, if you're talking about violating an Isser for the sake of Pikuach Nefesh, then it could be that in many circumstances, says the Chassam Sofer, will rely on the Rofe to tell us there's a danger involved here, will override the Surim. However, when it comes to a general evaluation of the Rofim, that cannot paskin the Shaila, that would not be enough to rule in a particular case. In any event, if we take into consideration as an overall picture of these tshuvas based on the Gemara in Nida that we started with, and also the Gemara at the end of Yuma, we see quite clearly that we will rely on Rofim to give us an insight into nature, to the biology of something, and especially if they are absolutely convinced. And therefore, Rav Shechter, based on these tshuvas, comes to the conclusion that since the Rofim are absolutely convinced about the nature and the operation, the mechanics of this vaccine, in this case, even the Chassam Sofer would say that we rely on the Rofim. And in truth, what happens here is that not only are we relying on Rofim who may or may not be Jewish, but we're relying on Rofim here who are Orthodox Yirei Hashem, like I mentioned, this Dr. Glad at the beginning. There are many others here in Israel especially. And they are giving full support in favor of this vaccine. So it's the Chassam Sofer, and even plus, we're going even beyond the Chassam Sofer, because Chassam Sofer is talking about non-Jewish Rofim, and we rely on them to evaluate nature and give us the Klolei HaTeva, and then we will apply those Klolei HaTeva to each guf bifnei atzmo, to paskin, and there are certain limitations. We don't just carte blanche rely on the Rofim straight across the board. We have to rely on our own Chachmei Yisrael. We mentioned the Divrei Shmuel, who says that if there's a collision between the Rofim and the Chachmei Yisrael, he weighs in favor of the Chachmei Yisrael. But again, here, we really don't have a controversy between the Rofim and the Chachmei Yisrael. As we said before, we have a long list of the Chachmei Yisrael who are weighing in at least in favor of defining the vaccine as something that's praiseworthy, if not obligatory. Yeah, Joe, did you want to ask something?
Just confirming what you're saying, that the basically the because the concern with regards to this being fatal is minute with regards to the entire population,
Well,
right?
that was the case of smallpox. Here we're saying we haven't had one case yet out of 80,000 of a death.
No, I'm not saying that.
Oh, okay.
I'm not saying from the vaccine. I'm saying from the illness itself,
Oh, the
right?
illness itself.
Its percentage of killings is, but they're saying that even though that percentage is so small, that's still enough that it takes precedence.
Correct.
Okay.
Because the mitzvah of Hishamalecha and the lotas of lotasim dam veisech, which applies to any danger, certainly applies in the case of COVID. And the numbers of people who have perished from this disease is very staggering. And they're predicting, I don't want to say it out loud, but it might even double in the United States, for example. Here in Israel, I'm not up on the latest. I do get the whiff of it that my wife tells me that the numbers are still very, very tricky. And Israel's taken slowly but surely, some more radical measures. But how long will it take until this vaccine is, number one, administered or taken by so many people that it would have a major impact on what they call herd, immunity? I've heard different evaluations, but no one thinks it's going to really change much before the summertime. Again, but that's as far as the klal, as far as the community is concerned, to lift all the restrictions for the entire community. As far as the individual is concerned, they're talking about 1 month, meaning 1 month, you can count 30 days from the day you're vaccinated, and then you'll get the second vaccination 21 days later, and then you wait another week until it really takes. A month later, you have developed antibodies of the nature of which, if you probably won't contract the disease at all, but even if you will, your body is already equipped with antibodies to fight off the disease, so that you may have certain, symptoms, but nevertheless, we're not going to even entertain the possibility of a life-threatening situation, so that personal immunity for each person who takes the vaccine, that's a mitzvah unto itself. Then there's a mitzvah klapi, the klal of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha that I said, that will have, again, you're one individual, but it'll have a ripple effect on the entire community, which again, we might not feel until the summertime. But just imagine life resuming to something similar to what we knew of before this epidemic. And I'm not just talking about the nuances and I meant to say the nuisances of wearing masks and social distancing. I'm talking about the ability to travel, the ability to see one's children and grandchildren. I'm sure you can tell stories more than I can, but I know a couple stories here of people who haven't seen their children a year, let alone their grandchildren. I have one of my buddies here in this neighborhood has his children in America. He hasn't seen his children or grandchildren in about a year or so. And the simchas, the limitations in davening. I could go on and on. I don't have to tell you how much this have an impact on our religious life, on our life in general, on our serenity, on our happiness, so that if this is a chance, and I think it's from what the experts are telling us, and we should rely on the scientific evidence and the claims of the physicians, the experts, that there's a good chance that we may have, to some extent, the resumption of normal life. That's what Rav Shechter meant, I think, when he said that maybe it's probable that we should be reciting the bracha Baruch HaTov HaMeitiv because this is not just Hametiv Li, it's not just a personal Hatava, but it's Hatava for the entire club. Okay, then, Rabbosai? So this is where we're going to stop for today. And I'm running over to Mincha now because in this part of the world, it's getting close to Shkia. And I want to thank you for everything and wish you all a
Thank
great.
you, it was excellent.
Thank you.
Rabbi
Wish you all-
Berzon, you're gonna give me the link? You're gonna give me the link? I want to make a donation to you.
Right. I did not receive your email. I wonder if you could send it again.
Okay,
Maybe I
Yes.
didn't identify it or so.
okay. AzariaBerzon@gmail.com.
Right.
I will send it right now.
Okay. Thank you
Thank you
so
for
much.
an excellent share. Okay, bye-bye.